The whisper followed Beatrice down the nave of St. George's. The unwanted wife. They weren't wrong. Arthur Pendleton, the Duke of Westford, hadn't looked at her once during the vows. She was a transaction, a piece of paper signed to pay off her father's staggering debts. She expected a life of quiet, cold indifference. She certainly didn't expect her new husband to be the one to finally break her father's iron grip. It took exactly 3 weeks, one unannounced visit, and a single, echoing crack across her cheek. The ink on the marriage settlements was still wet when Beatrice realized she was no longer a person. She was a property line. She sat rigidly in the corner of her father's study, blending into the faded burgundy velvet of the wing-back chair. Across the mahogany desk sat Arthur Pendleton, the Duke of Westford. He was 32, sharply angled and entirely devoid of charm. He did not smile. He wore a dark wool coat that smelled faintly of rain and horses, completely at odds with the cloying perfume of her father's London townhouse. The deed to the Sussex farmlands transfers upon the consummation, Lord Harrington said, his voice slick with artificial warmth. He poured a glass of brandy, his heavy gold signet ring clinking against the crystal. And the debts to Lord Roth are cleared by Friday? Arthur did not take the offered glass. He kept his gloved hands resting on the silver head of his walking stick. The debts will be cleared when the vicar signs the registry, Harrington. Not before. His voice was a low, resonant baritone. It wasn't cruel, but it was completely hollow. He hadn't glanced at Beatrice since he entered the room. He didn't need to. He was buying a valley that bordered his estate. Beatrice merely came attached to the deed, like a stubborn weed tangled in the roots of a prized oak. Lord Harrington's jaw tightened. He forced a laugh. Of course, Your Grace. Thoroughness is a virtue. Beatrice, my dear, come thank the Duke. Beatrice stood. Her corset was laced too tight, biting into her ribs. She kept her eyes fixed on the knot of Arthur's cravat. Thank you, Your Grace. Arthur finally shifted his gaze to her. His eyes were a pale, washed-out grey. They registered her plain brown hair, pulled back severely, her pale complexion, and the stiff set of her shoulders. He looked at her, the way a man inspects a carriage he intends to purchase but never drive. Miss Harrington, he murmured, a brief nod of his head. He stood up. I will send my carriage for you on Thursday morning. The ceremony will be private. Good day. He walked out. The door clicked shut. The silence stretched for 3 seconds before her father turned on her. The artificial warmth vanished, replaced by the ugly, sneering impatience she had known her entire life. You will not ruin this, Harrington hissed, stepping close enough that Beatrice could smell the stale tobacco and brandy on his breath. He grabbed her chin, his thumb pressing hard into her jawline. You will be quiet, you will be compliant, you will give him an heir, and you will ensure my allowance is paid on the 1st of every month. Do you understand? Yes, father, she whispered. She didn't blink. Blinking was a sign of weakness, and weakness invited worse than a pinched jaw. 3 days later, they were married. The church was empty, save for her father, the vicar, and a handful of gossiping maids loitering near the vestibule. Beatrice wore a heavy silk dress the colour of bruised plums, a leftover gown from her deceased mother, altered hastily by a cheap seamstress. It felt heavy, like armour. Arthur arrived precisely on time. He recited the vows with the rote efficiency of a man dictating a letter to his solicitor. He slid a heavy gold band onto her finger. It was slightly too large. It hung loose on her knuckle, a constant, physical reminder of how poorly she fit into this new life. As they walked out of the church, Beatrice caught the whisper of an old dowager who had stopped her carriage to watch the spectacle. Look at her, the unwanted wife, bought for dirt. Beatrice kept her chin high. She had survived 22 years under Lord Harrington's roof, by mastering the art of being unbothered. She climbed into the Duke's crested carriage, smoothing the skirts of her plum dress. Arthur climbed in opposite her, rapping his cane against the roof to signal the driver. The carriage lurched forward. The cobblestones rattled her teeth. Arthur opened a leather folio on his lap, pulled out a sheaf of correspondence, and began to read. They did not speak a single word all the way to Sussex. Westford Abbey was massive, damp, and overwhelmingly quiet. It sat in the centre of a sprawling valley, a fortress of grey stone covered in creeping ivy. When the carriage finally ground to a halt on the gravel drive, it was well past nightfall. A line of staff waited in the main hall. They looked at Beatrice with a mixture of pity and polite wariness. Arthur handed his coat to a footman and gestured vaguely to a stout woman in a severe black bombazine dress. "This is Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper," Arthur said, barely looking up. "She will show you to your rooms. I have business with my steward." He turned and walked down a long, dimly lit corridor. He didn't look back. "This way, Your Grace," Mrs. Higgins said softly. Beatrice followed her up the grand, sweeping staircase. Her chambers were located in the east wing. They were cavernous and draughty, dominated by a massive four-poster bed draped in heavy velvet. A small fire sputtered weakly in the grate. When the maid finally unlaced her and left her alone, Beatrice stood in the centre of the room. The silence pressed against her ears. She expected to feel lonely, but as she listened to the wind howling against the leaded glass windows, a different sensation washed over her. Safety. There were no heavy footsteps pacing the floorboards beneath her. There was no smell of stale cigar smoke seeping under the door. There was no threat of sudden, explosive violence over a misplaced spoon or a loud sigh. There was only Arthur's indifference, and indifference was a vast, open field compared to the cage she had grown up in. Over the next 3 weeks, Beatrice learned the geography of her husband's silence. Arthur woke before dawn and rode out to the tenant farms. He returned late. They took dinner at opposite ends of a mahogany table that could seat 20. The only sounds were the scraping of silver against porcelain and the ticking of the grand clock in the corner. He did not demand conversation. He did not demand her body. The consummation her father had obsessed over had not occurred, and Arthur seemed entirely uninterested in rectifying that fact. Beatrice, left completely to her own devices, began to work. She hated idleness. She started with the Abbey's neglected ledgers. She found Mrs. Higgins overwhelmed by the sheer size of the household. Beatrice quietly took over the ordering of provisions, the inventory of the linens, and the management of the kitchen gardens. She did not ask for permission. She simply did it. One night, unable to sleep, Beatrice walked down to the library to find a book. She wore a simple cotton wrapper, her hair falling in a loose braid down her back. She opened the heavy oak door and froze. Arthur was sitting by the fire. A glass of whiskey sat untouched on the table beside him. He had his coat off, his shirt sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and a long, jagged scar running near his wrist. He was staring into the dying embers, rubbing the bridge of his nose in exhaustion. He heard the door and turned. His grey eyes caught the candle light. "I apologize," Beatrice said quickly, taking a step back. "I thought the room was empty." "It's fine," he said. His voice was raspy from disuse. He looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time since the altar. His gaze dropped to the ledger she held under her arm. "What is that?" "The household accounts," Beatrice answered, bracing herself for a reprimand. Her father hated women touching numbers. "Leave the thinking to your betters, Bee," he used to say, usually accompanied by a sharp shove. Arthur held out his hand. Hesitantly she crossed the room and handed him the leather-bound book. He opened it. He flipped through the pages. The silence stretched. Beatrice's heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. "You renegotiated the coal contract," he said flatly. The previous merchant was charging a premium for delivery, yet sending half-loads, Beatrice replied, keeping her voice even. I found a local supplier willing to match the price for full tons, provided we pay upon delivery rather than on credit. Arthur stared at the numbers for a long moment. Then he closed the ledger and handed it back to her. Efficient, he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly, but it wasn't an insult either. Good night, Your Grace, she murmured. Good night, Beatrice, he replied. It was the first time he had used her name. She walked back to her room, the syllables echoing strangely in her head. He was a cold man, a distant man. But as she crawled into her massive empty bed, she realized he was not a cruel one. She could survive a cold man. The fragile peace shattered on a rainy Tuesday. Beatrice was in the morning room, checking the inventory of the winter preserves, when she heard the crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel. A harsh, familiar voice echoed in the entrance hall, barking orders at the footman. Her stomach dropped. The cold dread that had been absent for 3 weeks returned in a rush, turning her hands to ice. She stood up, her fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. The door swung open. Lord Harrington strode in, looking damp and violently irritated. He hadn't bothered to wait for the butler to announce him. "There you are," he snapped, stripping off his wet leather gloves and throwing them onto a velvet settee. "God, this place is a tomb. Doesn't the Duke believe in lighting a fire?" "Father," Beatrice managed to say, her throat tight. "What are you doing here?" "I've come to see my daughter, obviously," he sneered, pacing the room. He stopped to inspect a silver candlestick, picking it up and weighing it in his hand, as if appraising it for pawn. "And to speak with your husband." "Where is he?" "Arthur is out riding the estate borders. He won't return until evening." Harrington scoffed, dropping the candlestick back onto the table with a loud clatter. "Riding the borders, like a common farmer. I swear the man has the title of a king and the ambitions of a ploughman." He turned to look at her, his eyes narrowing. "You look pale and thin. Has he not taken you to his bed yet?" Beatrice felt the colour rise to her cheeks, a mix of shame and rising anger. "That is not your concern." "It is entirely my concern," Harrington barked, closing the distance between them. Beatrice instinctively took a step back, her back hitting the heavy oak bookshelves. "My allowance from him relies on your utility, Beatrice. If you are not producing an heir, you are useless to him. And if you are useless to him, you are useless to me." "The allowance was agreed upon in the settlements," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "He pays it. I've seen the ledgers." "It's not enough," Harrington snapped. He leaned in, crowding her space. The smell of gin and wet wool was suffocating. "I have invested in a venture. A tin mine in Cornwall. It requires capital. I need you to ask the Duke for an advance on the next 3 years of the allowance." Beatrice stared at him in horror. "A tin mine? Father, Cornwall is tapped out. It's a fool's errand. You'll lose everything." "Don't tell me my business, you ungrateful little wretch," he spat. "You will ask him tonight." "No." The word slipped out before she could stop it. It was quiet, but it hung in the air like a gunshot. Harrington froze. His face went dangerously blank. The sudden absence of anger was always the most terrifying part. It meant the violence was no longer a threat. It was a certainty. "What did you say to me?" he asked softly. "I won't do it," Beatrice said, her voice shaking now. She pressed herself flat against the bookshelf. "He married me for the Sussex land. He owes you nothing more. I will not beg him for money to fund your gambling disguised as investments." "You defiant little bitch," Harrington hissed. "He didn't pull back. He didn't telegraph the strike. He simply swung." The back of his hand caught her square across the left cheekbone. The force of it snapped her head to the side. The heavy signet ring tore the delicate skin just below her eye. Beatrice stumbled, her hip crashing into the small side table, sending a vase of white roses shattering onto the floorboards. Water and broken porcelain scattered across the rug. Beatrice touched her cheek. Her fingers came away wet with blood. The stinging pain was sharp, familiar, and utterly degrading. She braced herself, waiting for the kick or the follow-up blow, squeezing her eyes shut. "If you ever touch her again," a voice said, low and carrying the weight of a collapsing mountain, "I will take your hand off at the wrist." Beatrice gasped and opened her eyes. Arthur was standing in the doorway. He was drenched from the rain, his heavy riding coat dripping water onto the pristine floor. His riding crop was gripped so tightly in his right hand that the leather was audibly creaking. The hollow, empty look in his grey eyes was gone. In its place was a quiet, absolute fury that chilled the room by 10 degrees. Harrington spun around, his face instantly morphing from viciousness to a greasy, panicked smile. "Westford, Your Grace, I didn't hear you arrive. I was merely disciplining my daughter. She forgets her place." Arthur stepped into the room. He didn't look at Harrington. He kept walking until he was standing directly between Beatrice and her father. He was a full head taller than the older man, broader in the shoulders, radiating a tightly coiled, dangerous energy. "She is my wife," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft register. "She has no place beneath your hand. Ever." Arthur slowly turned his head to look at Beatrice. He saw the blood trickling down her cheek. He saw the way she was pressed against the bookshelf, shaking. A muscle in his jaw feathered. He dropped his riding crop onto the table. He reached out, slowly, deliberately, and pulled a clean linen handkerchief from his pocket. He didn't hand it to her. He stepped closer and gently pressed the cloth to the cut beneath her eye. His touch was shockingly light. "Did he ask you for money?" Arthur asked her quietly, his eyes fixed on the wound. "Yes," Beatrice whispered. Arthur nodded once. He turned back to Lord Harrington. "Your allowance is terminated," Arthur said flatly. Harrington's face went purple. "You cannot do that! It is in the contract!" "Sue me," Arthur replied, his voice dead calm. "Bring the contract to Chancery. Let us stand before a judge and discuss why the Duke of Westford broke a settlement. I will tell them it was a penalty for trespassing on my estate and assaulting a duchess." Arthur took a step forward. Harrington instinctively took a step back, tripping slightly over the edge of the rug. "Get out of my house," Arthur said. "Beatrice," Harrington sneered, trying to salvage some shred of authority. "Tell your husband." "I said," Arthur roared, the sudden volume making the glass in the windows vibrate. "Get out." Harrington swallowed hard. He looked at Arthur's fists, looked at Beatrice, grabbed his wet gloves from the settee, and practically ran from the room. The heavy front door slammed shut a moment later. The silence rushed back in, but it felt different now. Heavy. Charged. Arthur stood perfectly still, listening to the carriage wheels tear out of the driveway. Then he turned back to Beatrice. The terrifying fury had vanished, replaced by something much more complicated. He reached out and gently took the bloody handkerchief from her trembling hand, pressing it back against her cheek himself. "I am sorry," he said, his voice rough. "I should have been here." Beatrice stared at him. She was 22 years old, and it was the very first time in her life a man had apologized to her. The library remained terrifyingly still after the carriage wheels faded into the distance. Beatrice stood frozen against the bookshelves. The sharp sting on her cheek was a grounding anchor in a room that suddenly felt entirely foreign. Arthur did not step away. He kept the linen pressed to her skin. His knuckles grazed her jawline. They were cold, rough from holding the reins, and remarkably steady. "Press this," he instructed, his voice low. Beatrice brought her hand up, her fingers brushing his as she took over holding the handkerchief. Arthur finally stepped back. He looked down at the shattered vase, the puddle of water, the bruised white petals scattered across the Persian rug. He didn't call for the servants. He crouched down, his heavy wool coat pooling on the floor, and began picking up the jagged shards of porcelain with his bare hands. "You don't have to do that," Beatrice said. Her voice sounded thin, reedy. The maids will gossip," Arthur interrupted, not looking up. "And I will not have my staff discussing the colour of your bruises over their supper." He piled the broken porcelain onto a silver tray. He was meticulous. He found every tiny, razor-sharp sliver. When he finished, he stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, and poured a stiff measure of whiskey from the decanter. He didn't drink it. He walked back to her and held the crystal glass out. "Drink," he said. Beatrice took it. She hated whiskey. Her father smelled of it when his temper was at its worst. But she took a sip, the liquid burning a harsh, fiery trail down her throat. She coughed, her eyes watering. Arthur pulled a chair from the writing desk and positioned it near the fire. "Sit down," she obeyed. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in her bones. She sank into the leather chair, pulling her knees together. Arthur stood by the mantel, leaning his forearm against the dark wood, staring into the flames. "How often did he hit you?" Arthur asked. It wasn't a gentle question. It was forensic. A doctor probing a wound to see how deep the rot went. Beatrice looked down at the glass in her hands. "Only when I proved inconvenient." "That is not an answer. It is the only answer I have, Your Grace." Arthur turned his head. His pale grey eyes locked onto hers. The formality of her address seemed to grate on him. "My name is Arthur." "Arthur," she corrected softly. He stared at her for a long moment, the muscle in his jaw working. "I am not a violent man, Beatrice. I find it inefficient. It requires a loss of control, and I despise losing control. But when I saw him touch you," he stopped. He looked down at his own hands, resting on the mantel. "I would have killed him. I am a magistrate. I know the law, and I would have beaten him to death on my own floorboards." The admission hung in the air. It was a terrifying confession, stripped of all polite society pretense. It wasn't romantic. It was raw, ugly, and fiercely protective. "He is my father," she whispered. "He is a parasite," Arthur countered flatly. "And his access to you is permanently severed. The footman will be instructed. If he steps foot on Westford land, he will be shot for trespassing." He walked over to the bell pull and gave it a sharp yank. A few moments later, Mrs. Higgins appeared in the doorway, her eyes darting nervously between the Duke and his wife. "Mrs. Higgins," Arthur said smoothly. "Her Grace tripped against the side table and suffered a minor injury. Please fetch some ice from the kitchens and a tin of calendula salve." The housekeeper's eyes widened slightly as she took in the ruined vase and the bloody handkerchief, but she was a professional. She bobbed a curtsy. "At once, Your Grace." Dinner that evening was a disruption of their established routine. Beatrice sat at her usual place at the foot of the long mahogany table. The cut on her cheek throbbed, painted over with a thick layer of yellow salve. She expected Arthur to take his seat at the far end, separated by 12 feet of polished wood and silver candelabras. Instead, he walked past his chair. He pulled out the seat immediately to her right, directly in her line of sight, and sat down. The footman serving the soup froze, a ladle of clear broth hovering mid-air. Arthur gave him a flat, impatient stare. The footman quickly served them and retreated to the edges of the room. They ate in silence for 10 minutes. The proximity was startling. Beatrice could smell the faint scent of rain and saddle leather that clung to him. She could see the fine lines around his eyes. "The Sussex land," Beatrice said suddenly, breaking the quiet. She didn't look up from her plate. That is why you married me. To secure the borders. Arthur set his spoon down. Yes. Why didn't you just buy it outright? My father was desperate. He would have sold it without the marriage. I tried, Arthur said. 3 times. He refused. He knew the land was the only leverage he had to secure a title for his daughter. He wanted a duke in the family to legitimize his own standing in London. He told my solicitors the land came with the girl, or not at all. Beatrice swallowed hard. The land came with the girl, an accessory to a mud patch. I needed the valley, Arthur continued, his voice devoid of pity. It controls the primary water source for my lower tenant farms. Without it, 300 people lose their livelihoods during a dry summer. I weighed the cost of a wife against the cost of a drought. It was a brutally honest assessment. Beatrice appreciated it. She preferred harsh truths to pretty lies. You made a poor bargain, she said, finally looking at him. The valley is fertile, but you acquired a liability. My father will not stop. If you cut off his allowance, he will find another way to extract blood. Arthur picked up his wine glass. He looked at her over the rim, his eyes catching the candlelight. Let him try, Arthur said. He is used to fighting a terrified girl. Let him see what happens when he fights a duke. The summons arrived 2 weeks later, sealed with the heavy wax crest of the Court of Chancery. Arthur stood by the window in his study, the grey morning light casting long shadows across the floorboards. He read the heavy parchment twice, his expression hardening into stone. Beatrice sat quietly in the wing-back chair, updating the ledger for the grain stores. She watched him carefully. She had learned to read the micro-expressions of his silence. A tightened jaw meant annoyance. A still, unblinking stare meant fury. Right now, he was entirely still. "Pack your trunks," Arthur said, tossing the letter onto the desk. "We are going to London." Beatrice's pen paused. A drop of black ink fell onto the pristine page, ruining the column of numbers. "London, your father has filed a formal grievance," Arthur said, turning to face her. "He claims I coerced the marriage under false pretenses, that I have sequestered you against your will, and that the union remains unconsummated. He is attempting to void the marriage settlements to reclaim the Sussex land and sue for emotional damages." A cold sweat broke out on the back of Beatrice's neck. "Can he do that?" "He can try to drag my name through the mud," Arthur replied, his voice a low rumble. "He is banking on my distaste for public scandal. He assumes I will reinstate his allowance to keep him quiet." "Will you?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of panic. If Arthur paid him, it meant her father still had power. It meant she was still just a pawn on his board. "I do not negotiate with extortionists," Arthur said bluntly. He walked over to the desk and leaned against it, crossing his arms. "But we must return to the city. We must attend the remaining weeks of the season. We must be seen. Together." Beatrice looked down at her hands. Her fingernails were short and unpolished. She wore a simple, dark blue wool daydress. The cut on her cheek had healed into a thin, pale pink line, but she felt entirely exposed. "Arthur," she started, the name still feeling strange on her tongue. "I cannot face them. The ton knows why we married. They know he sold me. If I walk into a ballroom, they will tear me apart." "Let them try," he said. "You don't understand. Society is a blood sport. I am not equipped. I don't have the pedigree, I don't have the wit, and I certainly don't have the wardrobe to play the part of a duchess." Arthur looked at her for a long time. He took in her rigid posture, her pale face, the genuine terror in her eyes. "Mrs. Higgins," Arthur called out, his voice carrying easily through the open door to the hall. The housekeeper appeared instantly. "Send a rider to Madame Delacroix in Mayfair," Arthur instructed. "Tell her I am bringing her Grace to London tomorrow. I require her entire shop closed for a private fitting on Thursday morning. If she protests, double her usual fee. "Arthur, no," Beatrice protested, standing up. "I don't want you spending money on me. It feels—" She trailed off. She couldn't say the word. Transactional. "You are going to war, Beatrice," Arthur said quietly. "A soldier does not ride into battle wearing rags. You will be armored." The fitting at Madame Delacroix's was an exercise in exhaustion. For 6 hours, Beatrice stood on a velvet pedestal, while seamstresses pinned, tucked, and draped fabrics around her. Arthur did not wait in the carriage. He sat in a delicate gilt chair in the corner of the shop, his presence entirely overwhelming the pastel, perfumed space. Madame Delacroix, a shrewd Frenchwoman who recognized power when she saw it, tried to push Beatrice toward pale pinks, ruffles, and soft, demure lace. "Non," Arthur interjected from the corner. He hadn't looked up from the newspaper he was reading. The modiste paused, a length of pink silk slipping from her hands. "Your Grace?" "My wife is not a confectionery," Arthur said, finally folding the paper and standing. He walked over to the bolts of fabric lining the wall. He ran his hand over a roll of heavy, midnight blue velvet, then a striking emerald green silk. "She is the Duchess of Westford. Dress her like it." He selected deep, saturated colors, jewel tones that made Beatrice's pale skin look like porcelain rather than sickly. He chose structured bodices, high necklines with dramatic lines, and fabrics that held their own weight. He refused anything fussy. When Beatrice looked in the mirror wearing the final fitting of a blood-red silk gown, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. The severe bun was gone, her brown hair pinned up in an elegant, intricate coil. The dress clung to her waist and flared out in a massive sweep of skirts. It was intimidating. It was magnificent. She looked past her own reflection and met Arthur's eyes in the mirror. He was standing behind her. "Are you satisfied?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The question," Arthur replied softly, his gaze locked on hers in the glass, "is whether you are ready." She lifted her chin. The pale pink scar under her eye caught the light. It wasn't a flaw anymore. It was a casualty of the last battle she would ever lose. Yes, the Earl of Danbury's summer ball was the premier event of the late season. The grand house on Park Lane was ablaze with 1,000 wax candles, the string quartet drowned out by the roar of 300 aristocrats desperate for gossip. When the carriage pulled to a halt, Beatrice felt her stomach drop to her knees. Her hands, encased in elbow-length white silk gloves, trembled, Arthur noticed. He didn't offer a platitude. He stepped out of the carriage, turned and offered his hand. "Breathe," he ordered softly. "Keep your eyes on the far wall. Do not look at their feet. Do not look at their faces. You own the ground you walk on." Beatrice took a sharp breath, placed her hand in his, and stepped down. The moment the major domo banged his staff and announced, "Their Graces the Duke and Duchess of Westford," the ballroom went dead silent. The music seemed to falter for half a beat. Beatrice locked her arm through Arthur's. He felt like a pillar of iron beside her. Together, they descended the grand staircase. The whispers started immediately, rustling like dry leaves in a strong wind. They were not subtle. "Oh, bought her to clear Harrington's gambling debts. Looks entirely different, doesn't she? Someone paid for a decent modiste. Here they sleep in separate wings. A sham, my dear, a complete sham." Beatrice kept her chin high. The midnight blue velvet of her gown absorbed the candlelight, making her look stark and regal. She focused on the gilded moulding on the far wall, just as Arthur had instructed. They navigated the room. Arthur was a master of the polite dismissal. He greeted peers with curt nods and steered Beatrice through the predatory crowd with military precision, but they couldn't evade everyone. Near the punch bowls a blockade formed. Lord Davenport, a notoriously cruel viscount, and a known associate of Lord Harrington, stepped directly into their path. He was a fleshy man with a permanent, mocking smile. "Westford," Davenport drawled, bowing with exaggerated slowness. "What a rare treat to see you in town. And your bride. I must say, you clean up remarkably well, my dear." The insult was thinly veiled. It implied she was dirt before. Arthur's grip on Beatrice's arm tightened incrementally. "Davenport, step aside." Now, no need for hostility," Davenport chuckled, swirling his champagne. He looked Beatrice up and down. "Your father was just telling me about your sudden departure from the country. A tragic misunderstanding, he called it. He's quite worried about your welfare, Your Grace. He fears you are being kept in the dark about certain realities of your position." Beatrice felt the heat rise in her throat. Her father was in the room. He was hiding behind Davenport, using him as a proxy to test their defenses. She felt Arthur tense, preparing to verbally eviscerate the Viscount. But Beatrice didn't want Arthur to fight this battle. This was her terrain. She placed her free hand over Arthur's, a silent command for him to wait. Beatrice met Davenport's mocking gaze perfectly. She did not blink. "Lord Davenport," Beatrice said, her voice carrying an icy, ringing clarity that cut through the surrounding chatter. "My father is a man prone to exaggerated worries, just as he is prone to exaggerated investments. Speaking of which, I was reviewing the Westford estate ledgers just last week." Davenport's smile faltered slightly. "Ledgers?" "Yes," Beatrice continued smoothly, taking a half-step forward. The velvet of her gown rustled heavily. "I noticed an anomaly regarding the coal shipments from your northern mines to our foundries. The contract stipulates payment upon delivery of 300 tons monthly. Yet the tonnage weighed at our gates has been consistently 20% light for the past 4 months. The silence around them deepened. People were actively eavesdropping now. Davenport's face lost its color. I assure you, Duchess, there must be a clerical error, a miscalculation by your steward." "I am the one who calculates the household accounts, my lord," Beatrice said, her tone pleasant but razor-sharp. "And my arithmetic is flawless. You are defaulting on a contract to a duke to cover your own shortfalls. If the missing 80 tons are not delivered by the end of the month, I will have our solicitors file a lien against your primary estate." Davenport opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish pulled onto a dock. He glanced at Arthur, expecting the Duke to silence his wife for speaking of business in a ballroom. Arthur did not silence her. He looked down at Beatrice, his pale grey eyes alight with a dark, profound amusement. "You heard the Duchess," Arthur said softly to Davenport. 80 tons. By the 30th. Arthur placed his hand on the small of Beatrice's back and guided her past the stunned Viscount. The crowd parted for them instantly. The whispers had changed. They were no longer mocking. They were fearful. When they reached the terrace doors, out of earshot of the worst gossips, Arthur stopped. He turned her to face him. "You did not tell me Davenport was skimming the coal deliveries," Arthur said. "I was going to file the paperwork on Monday," Beatrice replied, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I thought it best to handle it quietly," until he decided to speak. Arthur stared at her. The cold, impenetrable wall he kept between himself and the world had fractured completely. He reached up, his gloved hand lightly tracing the line of her jaw, his thumb resting just beneath the faded scar. "You are a terrifying creature, Beatrice," he murmured, his voice thick with a sudden raw reverence. "I learned from watching you," she answered, holding his gaze. Arthur leaned in. It wasn't a sudden, passionate grab. It was deliberate, slow, giving her every opportunity to pull away. He kissed her. It was a firm, bruising assertion of absolute solidarity. When he pulled back, the air between them had fundamentally altered. The transaction was dead. The partnership had begun. The Court of Chancery smelled of old dust, floor wax, and centuries of bitter resentments. The chamber was small, lined with dark oak panels that seemed to absorb the meagre light struggling through the high, leaded windows. Beatrice sat at a heavy mahogany table beside Arthur. Her posture was rigidly straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap over a plain, charcoal-grey day dress. She wore no jewellery save for the oversized gold band on her left hand. Next to her, Arthur was a study in absolute stillness. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored coat. He did not fidget. He did not look around the room. He kept his eyes fixed on the empty magistrate's chair. Across the aisle, Lord Harrington sat with his solicitor, a weasel-faced man named Mr. Finch. Harrington looked haggard. The past weeks in London without his customary allowance had taken a toll. His collar was slightly frayed, and the reddish hue of his cheeks spoke of cheap gin rather than fine brandy. When he looked at Beatrice, his eyes burned with a toxic mixture of desperation and fury. The heavy wooden door behind the bench opened. Lord Albright, a magistrate known for his utter lack of sentimentality, took his seat. He adjusted his spectacles, opened a thick leather folder, and sighed. "Let us dispense with the theatricalities," Albright rasped, his voice like dry leaves over gravel. "Lord Harrington, you petition to void the marriage settlements of your daughter to the Duke of Westford. Your grounds are coercion, failure of consummation, and cruel treatment. Furthermore, you demand the restitution of the Sussex farmlands. Speak to your grievance." Mr. Finch stood up, practically vibrating with nervous energy. "My lord, it is a matter of public record that Lord Harrington was under extreme financial duress. The Duke of Westford preyed upon this desperation, forcing the inclusion of Lady Beatrice into a simple land transaction. Since the vows were spoken, the Duke has kept her sequestered at Westford Abbey, treating her as little more than a prisoner. He has withheld her from her family, ceased the agreed-upon financial support to her father, and the union itself remains a sham, unconsummated and devoid of affection." Finch paused for dramatic effect. "We ask that the contract be struck down as unconscionable. The land must return to its rightful owner, and Lady Beatrice must be freed from this tyrannical arrangement." Albright looked over his spectacles at Arthur. "Your Grace, do you care to respond to being called a tyrant before midday?" Arthur stood. He did not look at Finch. He did not look at Harrington. "The transaction was lawful, my lord," Arthur said evenly. "The settlement was drafted by Harrington's own solicitors. The Sussex land was exchanged for the clearing of £40,000 of debt to Lord Roth, which I paid in full on the morning of the wedding." Harrington slammed his hand on the table. "You bought my daughter like a brood mare, and you haven't even the decency to bed her or pay her keep." "Silence in my court," Albright snapped, banging a small wooden gavel. He turned back to Arthur. "Is it true, Your Grace, that you have isolated the Duchess and severed her father's allowance?" "I banned Lord Harrington from my properties," Arthur replied, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a dangerous edge. "I did so after he arrived uninvited, demanded an extortionate sum of money, and struck my wife across the face." The courtroom went dead silent. Finch paled. Harrington shot to his feet. "A lie!" Harrington shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Arthur. "A complete fabrication to cover his own breach of contract. He is trying to steal my land and my daughter's future. Where is the proof? She is a terrified girl, entirely under his control. She will say whatever he commands." Albright frowned, leaning forward. The accusation of physical violence among the peerage was a severe escalation. He looked at Beatrice. "Duchess," Albright said softly, "you are the centre of this maelstrom. The court will hear from you. Step to the stand." Beatrice rose. She felt the heavy gaze of every man in the room pressing down on her. She walked to the small wooden enclosure beside the magistrate's bench. She did not look at her father. She looked at Arthur. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. "You own the ground you walk on, Your Grace," Albright began gently. "Are you a prisoner in your own home?" "No, my lord," Beatrice said. Her voice was clear, ringing off the oak panels. "I am the manager of it." Albright raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Beatrice reached into the deep pocket of her dress and pulled out a small, black leather notebook. She placed it on the wooden rail of the stand. "My father claims I am terrified and controlled. I am neither," she stated, opening the book. "When I arrived at Westford Abbey, I took over the household accounts. I renegotiated the coal contracts, saving the estate £300 a quarter. I audited the tenant farming yields. I managed the provisioning. I am not a prisoner. I am a working duchess, and I am here entirely of my own volition." Finch stood up quickly. "Objection, my lord. These are menial tasks, likely forced upon her to justify her upkeep. It does not excuse the Duke's violence or his breach of the financial arrangement." "My husband is not violent," Beatrice interrupted, her voice suddenly sharp, cutting Finch off completely. She turned her head, fixing her father with a dead, unblinking stare. "The only violence I have suffered in my 22 years was at the hands of the man who sold me." "Liar!" Harrington hissed, his face purple. Beatrice ignored him. She looked back at Lord Albright. "My lord, my father is petitioning for this return of the Sussex land, claiming it is his rightful property. He asserts he was coerced." She opened the notebook to a specific page. "May I submit a piece of evidence to the court?" Albright nodded. "Proceed." "Before I left my father's house, I managed his private ledgers. I had to, as his solicitors kept resigning due to non-payment." She looked at Finch, who suddenly looked very ill. "The Sussex land was never unencumbered. 4 months before my marriage, my father secretly mortgaged the deed to a private, unlicensed lender in Cheapside to fund a fraudulent tin mining venture in Cornwall, a venture that collapsed a week before the wedding." Harrington froze. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. "What is this?" Albright demanded, sitting up straight. "A secret mortgage?" "Yes, my lord," Beatrice said coldly. "My father did not sell the land to the Duke to secure my future. He sold it to the Duke because the Cheapside lenders were threatening to break his legs. He allowed the Duke to clear his legitimate debts to Lord Roth, knowing full well the deed he transferred was already poisoned by illegal debt. He committed fraud." She stepped down from the stand, walked to the magistrate's bench, and handed over the black notebook. "The dates, the sums, and the name of the Cheapside lender are listed on page 42. I verified them myself." Albright read the page in silence. The scratching of his quill was the only sound in the room. He looked up, his eyes hard and flat. "Lord Harrington," Albright said, his voice laced with absolute disgust. "Is this true?" Harrington opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked at Mr. Finch, who was rapidly stuffing papers into his briefcase, desperately trying to distance himself from his client. "You bring a grievance to my court," Albright thundered, his gavel coming down with a crack that made Beatrice flinch. "You accuse a duke of coercion while committing gross financial fraud? You petition for the return of a property you had no legal right to sell in the first place." Albright looked at Arthur. "Your Grace, I am referring this matter to the criminal courts. Lord Harrington is facing charges of fraud and attempting to pass encumbered property to the peerage." He banged the gavel again. "Case dismissed. The marriage settlements stand. The land belongs to Westford. And if I were you, Harrington, I would find a very fast ship leaving the country." Arthur stood. He buttoned his coat. He did not look at the ruined man across the aisle. He walked over to Beatrice, offered his arm, and escorted her out of the suffocating room and into the cold, clean London air. The rain started precisely as their carriage pulled up to the Westford townhouse in Mayfair. It was a torrential, driving downpour that washed the soot from the cobblestones. Inside, the house was quiet. The staff had retired for the evening. Arthur dismissed the lone footman waiting in the hall and took Beatrice's wet cloak himself, hanging it over a brass hook. They walked into the drawing-room. A fire had been banked in the hearth, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. Beatrice walked to the window, watching the rain lash against the glass. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the trial was crashing, leaving her legs feeling like lead. She had done it. She had destroyed her father. She expected to feel triumphant. Instead, she just felt overwhelmingly, fundamentally exhausted. She heard the clink of glass behind her. Arthur walked over and pressed a tumbler of whiskey into her hand. "I don't like whiskey," she murmured, staring at the amber liquid. "Drink it anyway," he said softly. "It stops the shaking." Beatrice looked down at her hands. He was right. Her fingers were trembling so violently the glass was rattling. She took a deep breath and swallowed the liquor. It burned, but the heat spread outward, anchoring her to her own body. Arthur stood beside her, looking out at the dark street. He had removed his coat and cravat. His white linen shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. Without the armor of his formal wear, he looked younger and entirely human. "You kept the Cheapside ledger a secret," Arthur noted. "It wasn't an accusation." "I needed a killing blow," Beatrice answered, her voice hollow. "If I told you, you would have handled it. You would have paid the Cheapside lenders to make the problem vanish. I didn't want the problem to vanish. I wanted him ruined. I wanted to cut off his legs so he could never crawl back to me." She looked up at him, expecting to see disgust at her ruthlessness. A proper lady did not orchestrate the financial and social execution of her own father. Arthur was not looking at her with disgust. He was looking at her with a profound, quiet understanding. He reached out and took the empty glass from her hand, setting it on the windowsill. Then he rolled back the cuff of his right sleeve. Beatrice had seen the jagged scar near his wrist before, the night in the library, but she had never looked at it closely. It was thick, white, and raised, the mark of a deep, violent laceration that had healed badly. "My father was not a drunk," Arthur said quietly, his thumb tracing the old scar. "He was a perfectionist, a man who believed the title of Duke made him akin to a minor deity. He expected absolute compliance from his staff, his hounds, and his heir." Beatrice held her breath. Arthur never spoke of his family. The tongue whispered that the previous Duke had died of a sudden apoplexy, leaving Arthur the title at the age of 24. "I was 10 years old," Arthur continued, his eyes focused on the rain outside. "I dropped a hunting rifle in the mud. A minor infraction. He dragged me into the stables and decided to teach me a lesson about carelessness using a riding crop." Beatrice's stomach twisted. She instinctively reached out, her fingertips hovering just inches from his scarred wrist. "He swung," Arthur said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I put my arm up to block it. The crop had a silver cap on the end. It caught the flesh and tore it open to the bone." Beatrice let out a soft, shuddering breath. Her fingers finally closed over his wrist, her touch feather-light against the ruined skin. "He told the doctor I fell on a rusted scythe," Arthur said, turning his head to look at her. "I never corrected him. But I learned a very valuable lesson that day. I learned that power without restraint is merely butchery. And I promised myself I would never be at the mercy of another man's temper again." He looked down at her hand, holding his wrist. "When I saw Harrington strike you in the library, I did not just see your father. I saw mine. and I saw the same terror in your eyes that I used to see in the mirror. I am not terrified anymore, Beatrice whispered fiercely. I know, Arthur said. He stepped closer. The space between them vanished. You are terrifying. He lifted his hand, the one she was not holding, and cupped her face. His thumb brushed over the faded pink line beneath her eye. The consummation, Arthur murmured, his voice dropping to a rough, vibrating register. Finch made quite a point of it in court. Beatrice swallowed hard. Her heart was hammering a frantic, completely different rhythm now. It was a legal requirement to finalize the deed. The deed is final, Arthur said. His eyes, usually cold and unreadable, were dark and entirely focused on her mouth. The court has ruled. The land is mine. The transaction is complete. You owe me nothing, Beatrice. No duty, no heir, nothing. He let his hand drop from her face. He took a half step back, giving her the space, giving her the choice. It was the most agonizing distance she had ever felt. I do not want to be a transaction, Beatrice said, her voice shaking, but not from fear. You are not, he replied instantly. You are my equal. You are the Duchess of Westford. And if you ask me to leave this room, I will walk out that door, and I will never ask for your bed. Beatrice looked at the man who had picked up her broken glass, who had armored her in velvet, who had stood between her and a monster. She didn't want him to leave. She wanted to bridge the final, echoing silence between them. She reached out and grabbed the lapels of his white linen shirt. Do not walk out that door, she commanded softly. Arthur groaned, a low, harsh sound deep in his chest. He closed the distance, his hands finding her waist, pulling her flush against him. He kissed her. It wasn't the measured, deliberate kiss from the terrace. It was desperate. It was hungry. It tasted of whiskey and rain and years of tightly coiled restraint finally snapping. Beatrice kissed him back with equal ferocity. She tangled her hands in his hair, feeling the hard, solid reality of him. He lifted her effortlessly, her feet leaving the floor, and carried her out of the drawing room and up the sweeping staircase. There was no awkward fumbling in the dark. There was no cold duty. In the cavernous master suite, lit only by the embers of a dying fire, they dismantled the last of their walls. Arthur's touch was reverent, mapping the geography of her skin, not as a conqueror, but as a man starving for a home. And Beatrice, who had spent her entire life shrinking to avoid pain, finally allowed herself to take up space, to demand pleasure, to be entirely, unapologetically seen. When they finally lay tangled in the heavy linen sheets, the rain still battering the windows, Beatrice rested her head on Arthur's chest. She listened to the steady, rhythmic beating of his heart. Arthur, she whispered into the dark. He rumbled, his arm tightening around her waist. The Sussex land, she said, a small smile playing on her lips. It really is excellent soil for winter wheat. Arthur let out a sound that was remarkably close to a laugh. He kissed the top of her head. Go to sleep, Beatrice. The ledgers can wait until morning. 2 years later, the air in the Sussex Valley was crisp, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of autumn and wood smoke. From the crest of the hill, Westford Abbey looked less like a fortress and more like a heart, pumping life into the sprawling acres of gold and green that surrounded it. Beatrice sat astride a sleek bay mare, overlooking the lower tenant farms. She did not ride side saddle. It was wildly improper, and she did not care. She wore a tailored wool riding habit of deep forest green, her hair braided securely down her back. Beside her, Arthur sat on his massive black stallion. They were watching the harvest. A line of wagons, heavy with grain, was slowly making its way up the dirt road toward the Abbey's massive stone silos. The estate was thriving. The coal foundries were operating at peak efficiency. Lord Davenport had quietly surrendered a minor estate in Yorkshire to cover his clerical errors after Beatrice filed the lien. As for Lord Harrington, he was gone. After the Chancery hearing, the Cheapside lenders had come to collecting. Facing debtor's prison, Harrington had fled across the Channel to France in the dead of night. Beatrice had not heard from him since. She did not look for him. The rotten branch had been severed, and the tree was finally allowed to grow. "The yield from the lower valley is up 20% from last year," Beatrice noted, her eyes scanning the fields. "The new irrigation channels you designed are working." "They are working because you ensured the contractors used proper stone rather than the cheap shale they tried to smuggle in," Arthur replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. The harsh, hollow look he had worn when they first met was entirely gone. He looked settled. He looked happy. "A manager must be diligent," she teased, adjusting her leather reins. As she moved her hand, the autumn sun caught the gold on her left ring finger. It was no longer the oversized, heavy band that had hung loosely on her knuckle. A year ago, Arthur had taken the ring while she slept. He had given it to a master jeweler in London. When he returned it, it had been melted down and reforged. It was now a delicate, intertwined braid of gold and iron, a perfect, unyielding fit. He had told her that gold was for the title, but iron was for the woman who held it. "We should return to the house," Arthur said, glancing up at the sky. Heavy grey clouds were gathering in the west. "It's going to rain, and Mrs. Higgins will have my head if I let you catch a chill." "Mrs. Higgins is more afraid of me than she is of you," Beatrice pointed out factually. "True," Arthur conceded with a smirk, "but she knows I am the easier target." He nudged his stallion closer to hers. He reached out, his gloved hand covering hers on the pommel of her saddle. "Are you content, Beatrice?" he asked. It was a question he asked her often, a quiet check-in, a constant reassurance that her agency in this marriage was absolute. Beatrice looked out over the valley. She looked at the wagons, the thriving farms, the ancient stone of the abbey waiting for them in the distance. She looked at the iron band on her finger. And finally, she looked at the man who had bought her for dirt, only to give her the earth. "No, Your Grace," Beatrice smiled, leaning over to kiss him briefly, fiercely on the mouth. "I am the Duchess of Westford. I am far too busy to be merely content." She kicked her heels into the mare's flanks and took off down the hill, the wind catching her laughter. Arthur watched her go for a fraction of a second, his heart seizing with a fierce, possessive joy, before he spurred his own horse to follow her home. And that is how the unwanted wife became the undisputed ruler of Westford. Beatrice didn't just survive her trauma, she weaponized her competence and found a true equal in a man who understood the value of iron over gold. If you loved watching Beatrice orchestrate the ultimate revenge against her father and build a powerhouse partnership with Arthur, do me a favor. Smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who appreciates a fiercely competent heroine. Leave a comment below. What was your favorite moment of Beatrice's revenge? Until next time, keep your ledgers balanced and your boundaries strong.